this is a fun conversation for us. It's a complicated one, but we enjoy it because we love solving massively complicated problems for clients, and we think this is one of them. So the thing that for me, when I think of the ACA planning, for the folks that are joining this, when we say early retirement, that could mean a lot of things. But for me, it's anybody that's retiring before the age of 65. And it's already hard enough to save enough money to be able to retire, quote unquote, early. So if you've done that, kudos to you, because that's not an easy feat. But for the folks listening to this and some familiar faces that I see on this call, one of the biggest hurdles that I've learned over the years is then solving the healthcare piece. And it's not only that the cost of healthcare is so unaffordable in 2025, unless you have an employer plan, it's the concern around then going to healthcare.gov, picking a plan that you can actually rely on. So again, today's conversation for us is aimed around that. Our goals for today, we're going to try to address right on the next slide some of the most common misconceptions that we hear when it comes to the Affordable Care Act and healthcare.gov and planning around this. And we also want to help create an understanding of how these Affordable Care Act subsidies actually work, and then give you not only the mechanisms for it, but then some tax things to know about as well. And then through case studies, show you our planning strategies and some of the techniques that we use. For the folks that love the show, The Office, obviously Michael Scott's joining me. But Michael, you already saw the case study. Did you appreciate the name that I used in the case study?
Yes, it never gets old, and it
Jim and
certainly
Pam
livens up some case studies as well, because I know that they can be a little dry at times. So hopefully you guys find it a little humorous.
So let's start right out the gates with some misconceptions. So I think the first thing, most folks assume that these subsidies that they're not going to qualify for them. You're 60 years old, 59 years old, you're teeing up for retirement, you want to retire early, but you've got these sizable assets. The truth of the matter is this is means tested specifically based on income. And if you think about this logically, what can the IRS fact check? Well, they can look at a tax return. They can't peer in and see what your net worth looks like. And so the first one that I like to address is that the folks that think like, I'm not going to qualify for a subsidy, that might not be true. And again, throughout today, we'll talk about that. And then the next concern that I hear is like, okay, even if I do qualify, a lot of folks are concerned around the quality of these ACA plans and if it's even worth their considerations. And although it might be true that it's not quite as good as your employer plan situationally, I have learned that there are good plans that can accommodate many folks depending on their healthcare needs. So a couple of things right off the bat that I want to mention. All of these plans that are available on ACA require the coverage of pre-existing conditions. And they also require concerns that I hear a lot are like, if I go out of network, if I travel, something that's been added recently is the coverage of emergency care if you're out of network. I think that's an important one. They are going to be managed care style plans though. So it's going to be an HMO or a PPO style plan where you're working within a network of doctors. And then last but not least, the fears that I hear the most are about the Affordable Care Act being, 15 years into this, we've actually had five legislative attempts to repeal that. And I'm going to screen share this just in case, just for the sake of this conversation. So let me know, Michael, if you can see this. But
Yep,
I just thought this was a good visual to kind of go back and see in 2017, 19, 22, 23. And there's actually another one presently attempting to repeal the Affordable Care Act. And for me, we'll talk throughout today's conversation about this because there's some sunsetting of provisions that happen at the end of this year. The Trump administration is cutting the funding for things like navigators, which are federally funded employees that help you sort of navigate healthcare.gov. And they're cutting marketing funding. But, there's not an indication yet that it won't be here next year or the year after. In fact, I think that's kind of like the biggest risk of planning, but also what makes this so interesting. Like, this is what we do, right, Michael? Like the planning that we do to help folks. I think that's what good planning is about, is like there are things that will be out of our control. We try to plan for all those contingencies.
Yeah, and this will, we plan for it as if it's going to be around, but you can also think about this in a similar way as we think about tax rates, right? Like we make decisions on contributions to IRAs or Roth IRAs or saving in non-qualified accounts based on tax rates. And we know to some degree they're going to change in the future. However, we don't let the fact that we don't know what they're going to end up looking like in our retirement to keep us from doing something about it today. So
Yeah.
even if there is a change to this in the future, that doesn't mean we should put off getting a benefit today, tomorrow, and the next day just because that benefit may go away 5 years from now. Just something to keep in mind.
Yeah, yeah, well said, Michael. I think if you want to, let's maybe give a little bit lay of the land for the folk. I mean, and
Mhm.
most of you listening to this already know about this stuff, but give a lay of the land for ACA and just in general how it works.
Yeah, so Affordable Care Act was passed in 2010, put in place essentially by the Obama administration. And what it was really intending to do was expand healthcare coverage for individuals who are not covered at work and to put some common denominators across the board. And there's a lot of pros and cons to the way it's been done and the history of it over the past 15 years now. But essentially, it allows people to purchase health insurance through their state's health insurance marketplace. And it kind of leaves it up to the states to define this. So a lot of states are different. But essentially, what happens is you answer a couple questions on your state's marketplace, and then based on your income, you're given tax credits or the ability to purchase health insurance based on a certain cost. Now, a lot of times these tax credits are given to you in advance, but they're reconciled at the end of the year when you pay your taxes. So one of the things that John's mentioned, and we're going to talk a little bit more about, is truly identifying what your modified adjusted gross income is can have a major effect on your tax credits and this planning. And something to keep in mind is, generally when we think about paying taxes, the lower your tax burden, the better. However, in this case, we don't want to be too low because then we run the risk of qualifying for Medicaid, which is a whole different animal. But we also don't want to overshoot because then we're going to have to pay tax credits back. So there is a lot of planning that needs to go into how do we make the income a certain number and keep it at that number throughout the year, and then make sensible adjustments year after year because it can have some sizable effects moving forward.
Yeah, I think we'll talk about this too, but it's finding the sweet spot depending on your situation for what that modified adjusted gross income realistically can be, and then putting expectation around that. The truth of the matter is, though, folks that go on healthcare.gov and apply for a plan, the vast majority of them are doing this with the expectation of receiving some type of premium tax credit. 93% of enrollees that are presently on an ACA plan are receiving some form of a premium tax credit. And as you alluded to, Michael, they vary depending on what that modified adjusted gross income is. But give us a little. Yeah, go ahead.
I know you're going to go into specifics on how they come up with this and what the numbers are, but essentially your tax credits are based on your modified adjusted gross income. And like John mentioned, this is one of the only ways the government, the IRS, can tell wealth or income realistically to put these tests in place is to look at income. So really the goal here is to be at a lower modified adjusted gross income with the goal of getting higher subsidies, which in turn lowers your health insurance cost. Now, I kind of mentioned a little bit already, these tax credits can be in advance, but they're reconciled when you pay your taxes, meaning you get that credit throughout the year, and then when you go to file your taxes, if you underestimated your income, you may have to pay some of this tax credit back. However, that works in the other direction too. If you overestimated your income and your income comes in lower than expected, you can get that tax credit paid to you at that point as well. So again, it's that real crucial planning at this point of what will modified adjusted gross income be and how can we control it? Realistically, we don't want to be too low, like we said, we don't want to be on Medicaid, but we also don't want to go too high because that can substantially change the cost of healthcare.
Yeah, I like how you said that because it cuts both ways. So to that end about the tax credits, I have folks, and I'm gonna probably share this throughout the presentation. And actually, I should have if I did it correctly, Michael. Let me know if I didn't. But there should be a resource here to this link. And I really like using this as a resource, as like a starting point to kind of come in at, okay, what do we think modified adjusted gross income is? In this case is what I'm sharing. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
I'm sharing the KFF, the Kaiser Family Foundation. So we have 2 adults age 60. You can like enter all of these scenarios in here, and then you can have this tell you what your estimated financial help is. Now, I've done this enough with clients where I've seen the accuracy of this. Now, maybe it's slightly off, but it's for the most part pretty close and pretty accurate. And I like this because then it puts us in the driver's seat of, you likened it to taxes a while ago or earlier in this conversation, where, just because we don't know all the future legislative changes doesn't mean we don't do, good planning or tax planning, that type of thing. And with taxes, as you know, there's like a range. Like we try to hit a range of like how much we're going to get back or how much we're going to owe. And we're never going to hit the nail on the head exactly perfectly. But this website's a really good example of helping inform us of a range. And then we can decide, like some clients will choose to not take all of their credit. Maybe they'll not take any of it, or they'll take some of it because they don't want to have to owe a big tax bill if that number's, if we're wrong on modified adjusted gross income. So, something important to know when it comes to that. And I want to, I know I just shared this Kaiser Family Foundation chart, but all of that is informed based on this data that's given to us by the government that says what the federal poverty line is in America. And then from here, this is where they kind of inform decisions around how much your subsidy should be. So and for most of you that are on this call, if we're targeting the use of a plan like this to bridge the gap between, whenever you retire at 58 or 62 until age 65, most of you are going to be, living in this land where we're looking at a household of 1 and 2. So I always know when I share charts like this, people's eyes are like, oh my gosh, what like all this data, what are we doing here? But I kind of want you to focus on household family size 1 and actually 2. Let for the sake of this conversation. So the range is somewhere between 20,000 to 81,000, or 100% to 400% of the federal poverty line. Now, I mentioned this a couple of times. It was initially the American Rescue Plan Act, and then it rolled into the Inflation Reduction Act, where they actually increased premium support. Like they expanded the eligibility far past the 400% federal poverty line. Why am I not showing you that? Because at the end of this year, everything goes back to this. It goes back to this chart. So now we have to live inside of this percentage base. So then the real question becomes like, okay, can our modified adjusted gross income support living in the range of, in the 20 to 30,000 all the way up to 80,000 if we're a couple, for a family of 2 filing for these plans. And again, you'd mentioned this, so I want to acknowledge the sweet spot thing, Michael. Medicaid's a big deal. Like if our income falls below these thresholds, and the state of Florida did not expand the definition of Medicaid, so it's actually, I think it's even a little bit higher than this for a family of 2. But if you fall below this threshold, you technically should be going on Medicaid, not on an ACA plan with a tax credit. And that's not what we want either, because then, obviously we're sacrificing the quality of the coverage. So a little bit of diving in the weeds here on this information. Michael, did I do a good job explaining that?
Yeah, I think what's important here is to look at the household family size of 1 or 2. So either yourself and a spouse needs coverage. And we want to keep your income between 20 and 80,000. Above that, the credits really begin to phase out and it's not as beneficial for you. So keeping it within that range gives us a certain amount of credits over time. But probably what most people are thinking listening on this call is, John, my God, I make a lot more than that right now. How do we keep income, and how do I live my life with a $40,000 modified adjusted gross income? Like I can't retire off that. And I think that's really where a lot of the planning and the interesting piece is going to come out of this.
Well, we talked a lot about modified adjusted gross income. So I think we're about due for explaining what that actually is. So Michael, give us your explanation.
So modified adjusted gross income, we can find this on the tax return, but this really looks at any retirement plan withdrawals except for Roth. So think IRA, 401k, and other retirement plans. But also adds in your capital gains, your dividends, interest incomes from your investments. Any social security that you get that's taxable. We're also adding back in tax exempt interest, rental income. So a lot of those things that make up your income or your investment income gets put into that. And this is a big difference from just the adjusted gross income. A lot more things go into it. What doesn't count? Roth IRA withdrawals, HSA withdrawals, and anything that's coded as a return of principal, which is important because when we go to create the income stream, we want to be very careful and we want to be very controlling of what we actually put into modified adjusted gross income.
Yeah, I want to go back on one thing here because I think for the folks listening to this, they might be looking at this going like, taxable Social Security, what does that mean? And so just to explain that a little bit further, depending on where your income falls, and it's a pretty low threshold, the IRS is allowed to include anywhere from 0% of your Social Security benefit all the way up to 85%. That's the maximum number of your Social Security benefit. So if your benefit's $10,000 a year, I'm just doing simple math, and you're above this threshold across all of your other incomes, then $8,500 of that $10,000 is considered a taxable Social Security benefit, and that counts towards your modified adjusted gross income. So this is a really tricky, not an explainer, but this is a tricky component of the ACA thing, because a lot of times people look at their, after standard deductions, Michael, they look at that taxable income number, and that's like, we're talking pre-deductions. We're talking, in fact,
this is top line.
It's top line. And when you look at your return, you might see adjusted gross income, but there's tricky things in there. Like it's adding back in tax exempt interest. Like for example, if a client has municipal bonds, that gets added back in on top of. So it is the absolute top line number that they're using for this calculation. So that's a mistake I've seen made before. So I think this is a really important slide when we keep talking about modified adjusted gross income for folks to kind of have a better understanding of that. So Michael, what do we do now? Like up to this point, so we're 20 minutes in. We kind of given the lay of the land, understand modified adjusted gross income. We understand these ranges. We need to stay within 100 to 400% of the federal poverty line. What are some thoughts that you have for planning strategies to address those?
Yeah, and really with the interesting piece here is that generally this ACA planning and retirement planning piece comes in a line for people in their late 40s, early 50s who are looking to retire well before Medicare at age 65. So even if you're 49, 48 years old or your early 50s, this is a crucial time to potentially move some money around to set yourself up for the next 10 or so years. Because what are the goals here? We want to delay Social Security benefits because we went back, we just talked a lot about it. Social Security benefits count towards this. So if we can delay taking that, we don't have to include that income. Roth conversions. We talk about Roth distributions from IRAs or 401k plans don't count towards your modified adjusted gross income. That's all well and good, but if you don't have any Roth assets to take from, you can't utilize it. So Oftentimes we talk about doing Roth conversions to set this bucket up. The other piece to this is do we have after-tax savings or non-qualified accounts where we have a nest egg stored away? We always talk about we want to fund IRAs, we want to save in our retirement plans at work, but oftentimes if we want to retire early, we may need a bucket of assets that are not sheltered that way so we can create income from. And finally, investing in the non-qualified accounts accordingly, and that's a key piece because when we talk about what goes into the modified adjusted gross income is the capital gains, dividends, and interest income. So how do we set up the non-qualified accounts to be optimized in that way. Oftentimes that looks like securities that don't pay a lot of dividends. They may not be high interest bearing. And sometimes that means making these non-qualified accounts a little more equity growth oriented and using your IRAs, your retirement plans to balance out your risk profile and being more conservative there and locating the assets correctly within your asset allocation. So it's building the entire portfolio up to succeed in keeping the income low. Does that all kind of make sense, John?
Yeah, this is for me the joy of how we get to work together because, Michael, you being really focused on, I mean, you're a financial planner, as am I, as is Matt. All three of us are, but we have our areas, we have our skill sets. Matt specifically handles all of our tax planning for clients of ours here at Canterpath. Michael, your focus is on the investment management piece of this. And honestly, I've sort of by default have learned a lot about these ACA plans and Medicare planning, and it's become a fun part of how we basically tie all three of these areas together. Like I'm thinking of it as like a big Venn diagram of like the overshare of responsibility of these three areas. We have taxation, investment strategy, and then the healthcare planning itself. And the investment side is so critical, and we're going to show that in a case study in a moment. But I've seen this happen in real time. There's one client in particular who's actually on this call today, so I won't name names. But we did the strategy for the last 5 years for ACA planning for their family, and part of that strategy was balancing out how their non-qualified accounts were to ensure that we weren't doing things that produced additional capital gains and dividends. And so, Michael, you've been very important in that role for our clients. And I think one other thing I want to mention for folks watching this going like, oh, this is all great, but all right, I'm 62, I got 3 more years I want to do this for, and I don't have the Roth funds available, and maybe I don't have enough after-tax savings. That's ideal world stuff, but there's also, you said this before, Michael, but like there's a lot of moves to be made between 50 and 60. But there's also things that we can do that we have to, for example, an IRA distribution. We'd have to quantify the federal taxes that would be paid for that. We'd have to quantify a break even, and there's risk involved in all of that. But there's within these 4 bullet points, like you could drill down and focus on like a plethora of strategies. So there's a lot of moving pieces to it. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. And why don't we take a look at an example here, because there are so many moving pieces. Sometimes it's easier to see them when we talk through one. So let's take a look at this case study that we have set up here. And
it's Jim and Pam Halpert, so you're gonna love that. Hey, Michael, can we pause real quick before we do that? We got a really good practical question, and so the question is modified adjusted gross income for the current year you are applying for or your previous return. So it's for the year that you're applying for. So let's say we're applying in November of 2024. And that's kind of the crazy part of this this healthcare.gov application is they're going to ask you basically they're trying to arrive at what do you think your income will be in 2025? If we're answering this in November of 2024, what do you think your income is going to be in 2025? And so that requires a lot of planning to figure out how do we project that? How do we project dividends and interest and incomes that you receive and pensions and whatnot? And what do we think that number realistically will be? They might, once you do that and you sign up on a plan, they might send you a letter 60 days later saying, are you sure your income is going to be that number? Because last year it was way higher. And then you'll send a letter back. We've done this a bunch with clients. There's actually a template letter we've created that we send back to the IRS or to the government, and we say, yep, we're sure, we've retired, this was our stated income, this is our projected income for the year. And then it all comes out in the wash come April of next tax time. So, Michael, you mentioned that before, how it gets reconciled. But I just want to give a little bit of insight to the complicated matter of like, we're maybe sitting in November planning for a full calendar year of taxes to figure modified adjusted income for the next year. And then we're reconciling it in April of the following year. That's a pretty long cycle of the process. So anyway, did I answer that well? Anything you want to add?
You're really going to have to project what your income is 2 years before you reconcile it once, if you think about it in that way.
Mhm.
So to answer that question quickly, the modified adjusted gross income will be for the year of which you want coverage, and it's not looking back.
Yeah.
So taking a look at this case study here, Jim and Pam Halbert are both turning 59 this year. They've saved several $1,000,000 in various pre and after tax accounts and have paid their mortgage off and have modest living expenses. They believe they're ready to retire, but are fearful of health insurance costs and quality for the next 7 years until they reach Medicare. Um, Key things to look at here. It's going to be a very specific withdrawal plan from the portfolio. It's going to require an adjustment to their investment strategy. And in doing so, in this example, someone potentially could save over $150,000 between age 59 and 65 on their healthcare costs through these insurance credits.
Yeah. So let's kind of walk through that, because I think, when Michael and I were trying to come up with a strategy for how to best visualize this, there's again, I keep mentioning there's a lot of moving pieces. I had like a pro forma tax return ready to go, and we were going to show it that way. And we wanted to visually make this a little bit cleaner to see. And so, starting for Jim and Pam, we have a financial snapshot for them. So we've got assets and liabilities. This is their balance sheet. And as you can see, and as Michael mentioned, no mortgage is paid off. There's no debts. And so there's an investable asset base of about 3 million and a net worth of about 3.9 million. So probably the first thing that you see that might be alarming to you is, okay, so they're 59. They want to live on 10K a month, so $120,000 a year. And in order for this to work, or for them to get a substantial tax credit, we're targeting a modified adjusted gross income of $32,000 a year. So we're basically talking like a $90,000 difference between the cash flow that they need to support their life and what we need to show, for their tax return. And so conventional wisdom, for most folks, they might think, okay, I'm going to start withdrawing on my 401k. And this is just to kind of give you an illustration of, how somebody might take their withdrawals. And so anyone listening to this that's worked with us for a while, and there's a lot of faces and names on here that have, that we target a withdrawal rate of 4 to 5%. And so I've got 4% here on 3 million. That's 120,000. How we arrive at that for Jim and Pam in this case is generating about $100,000 of modified adjusted gross income at the moment. Now, this is confusing because you look at this number and go like, oh, okay, well, we've got dividends and interest. So technically, not all $47,500 coming out of this joint investment account is going to be taxed the same. Just because we took money out doesn't mean it's taxable. As Michael mentioned, return of principal in a non-qualified investment account is not a taxable event. But money coming out of your 401k, any dollar you take out of it, if it's pre-tax, is going to be a taxable situation. So what if we just change the order of operations for which, where money's coming from? And, I alluded to this a moment ago, Michael being our CFA and some of the things that he looks at from an investment lens, it would inform how this portfolio here is invested, this joint investment account, to ensure that we're doing things to hopefully reduce things like capital gains, or be mindful of capital gains, dividend interest, and so on. So what if we just change the order of operations here? Now we're looking at a situation where we've effectively accomplished it. We have $120,000 a year in income that they need to receive, but of that 120, only 32 is going to be taxable to their on their tax return. And it's not even so much the taxes itself that's valuable there, because again, once you have standard deductions and all that type of stuff, this family, this couple, is in a relatively low tax bracket. We're doing this not to reduce your tax liability as much as we're doing this to increase the availability of that Affordable Care Act tax subsidy.
Yeah. And if this was able to be pulled off and we were able to shift the distribution strategy around, this would
What
come
makes you
out
think
to,
you wouldn't be able to, Michael? Come on now. We can do it.
I would say the caveat with all of this, right, is life happens, right? If there is a sudden cash need, right? That can blow up the plan for the year. The nice thing is that every year things can be reset and we can re-attempt to do the plan. But I like to put that caveat in there because you never know what happens on any given one year. But assuming everything went well that year, you get almost a $27,000 benefit in the premium tax credit. And that's just one year at age 59. And I take this moment here to stop and say, hey, what happens, Michael? You said if we're able to, what happens if we're not? Well, the benefit is we can try again the next year. If you're living in a condo and you have a condo assessment and suddenly you have to take an extra 20,000, well, you might get a little bit lower of a benefit and that maybe changes it for a year, but following 12 months, we try it again. And if we're able to do it year after year after year, you're going to be able to see here that the benefit actually grows a little bit every year because we assume that there's a little bit of an increase to the benefit, but you get almost a $170,000 premium tax credit benefit over these 7 years of planning until you reach Medicare at age 65. And John, I know one of the caveats we said at the beginning, or one of the misconceptions or confusing things about this is what happens if the benefits change? What happens if this is repealed or coming up here? You know, we have the sunsetting of the first Trump tax cuts occurring at the end of the year. What if this is areas targeted for changing the benefit? What happens then for us?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm going to answer that, but you said something that I thought was really, really important to address. Can I go back a couple slides?
Sure.
I know I killed the flow by doing this, but all of this, like you had mentioned, like, you know, if you have an assessment and you have a cash need and something changes and you need to take a bigger distribution, that's accurate because life happens. But what I will say is this good planning, as good of all this as all this planning may be, if this number is wrong, so let me go back to this slide here where we talked about the cash flow need. If the budget's wrong and it's not 120, it's actually 150, that could really impact this quite a bit. And so it does, you know, everybody here listening to this, whether it's Matt, Michael, or myself, you've all heard us say, like, you need a budget. And, you know, when we're in our working years, maybe that budget's not as meaningful or impactful because, hey, we're on our working years, like we've got discretionary income, we can cover up a budgetary mistake. But when we're living on this number and we need to hone in on a modified adjusted gross income, the reliance of making certain, to the degree in which we can control, because to the point you made, Michael, like life does happen. But if it's just lifestyle expenses are much higher than we projected them to be, that could be a problem in this scenario-based planning. So sorry, I paused where you were at, but I really did want to acknowledge that piece because that's a pretty critical aspect to it. So to the point Michael was making, you know, again, this is what I would define as best case scenario. As you said, you know, there's provisions around the ACA subsidies that go back to their norm as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act at the end of this year. There's, you know, of course, I started this conversation by talking about the concerns around the viability of the long-term viability of the ACA. And so what if, you know, let's cut this number in half. Let's say subsidies at the end of this year are cut in half. Now, actually, you know, the legislation, the data that I'm reading is projecting about a 7% increase in premiums on an annualized basis going forward between like 2026 to 2033. But let's assume even more catastrophic, and let's assume it's cut in half. That's still a $98,000 decision if all these other variables can be managed on a year-to-year basis. That's awfully worth doing, in my opinion. And let's go really doomsday. Like, let's just say absolute worst case scenario is the only thing that we can say with certainty is that this year in 2025, we know for this year, these are the subsidies that we're eligible to get if we retire for Jim and Pam Halpert. And so there's $27,000. So, like, you know, would you make a change in your taxable situation to yield you $27,000 more for that year? I mean, like, I think the answer for everybody here listening is yes. And so again, kind of ending where we started, talking about the whole purpose of planning. Yeah, there's changes that might come down the pike that we can't predict yet, but I do feel confident that there'll be some form of it, at least for the next several years. Who knows how that'll change? But this to me is the absolute worst case scenario. But even in the worst case scenario, it's still the purchase of a car. I think that was a comment you made to me, Michael, when we were pre-planning this. You're like, that's still a car. Like, that's not a
Yeah,
small amount of money.
that's a car, that's a trip, that's, a kid's 529 plan. There's a lot of things that you could do with that simply by changing which account you take money from.
Yeah. Yeah.
What is
Amen to
really what
that.
it's being boiled down to.
Amen to that. So as we're wrapping, there's a couple of things. We've got about 7 more minutes before we end this webinar with you guys. So want to just kind of tie in some of the planning concerns that we hear often. Michael, do you want to
Sure.
take
And
a stab at this slide?
as I'm going through this, if you guys have any questions, feel free to throw it into the chat. We'll make sure we get it answered. But really, when we're doing these plans and we're working through them, we have a couple major concerns. Number one, obviously, should be modified adjusted gross income. Understanding what goes into that and building it correctly for you. If you're doing this yourself, misunderstanding what qualifies, such as tax exempt interest, could have a major problem for you when you get that tax bill 2 years later. Second piece is over or underestimating the income. I mean, like we said, this is all finding the sweet spot. This is finding what's required to make your life work. If you overestimate, or I should say, if you're underestimating how much income you need, that's going to have a sizable impact on your credits, and you're going to feel it when it comes time to reconcile. Also, when we think about this, the longevity of the ACA, like we've said, this could change any year. They could repeal this, they could change the credits. That should not inhibit us from doing this planning. Like John pointed out, just doing it 1 year is about a $27,000 benefit if you were doing this for 2025. I think most of us would agree, if we had the ability to do this, getting a $27,000 benefit for a single year is sizable and it's beneficial. And then finally, it's important to find the plan that works for you. We're talking about optimizing your retirement planning and finding a good balance for healthcare costs, but we also have to keep in mind you need the right plan for yourself. So identifying, are you suited on a bronze plan? Do you need the platinum plan? Can you get by on a silver? Should we get gold? Going back through those and understanding what the differences might be for those plans, I think is crucial. And John, I think you have a couple of these on here. Understanding what the difference between the different plans are and how they're administered going to help you make these decisions.
I've got a slide for that. But before I do, you've got here finding your sweet spot. And I think I just want to go back to this one more time, because in the case of Jim and Pam Halpert, their sweet spot and what we were able to reduce their modified adjusted gross income to was $32,000. So they're living in the range between 150 to 200% of the federal poverty line. That's what allows them to get this credit. Now, your sweet spot, like depending on your situation, it might be outside that range. It might be 300 to 308%. I think it's having a realistic expectation that you can't get this number all the way down. You might not be able to get this number all the way down as low as to the Medicaid level. It truly does depend on your situation, and that's what I think we mean when we say finding your sweet spot.
You also might not want to, right? We might be able to get the number down really close to that level, but that may inhibit you from taking a trip. And if we're talking about trying to squeeze a little bit more out of a credit, but you're sacrificing one of your goals in retirement, is it really that important? So it really is a sweet spot, not only financially, but what your goals are at the same time. And John, we had a good question here that I think before we talk through these different plans, what happens in our example, our spouses were the same age, but what happens if two spouses are different ages and one reaches a Medicare age and the other one is still trying to do an ACA plan? Is that a joint modified adjusted gross income, or is it individual? Do people need to file separately? How is that handled?
Yeah, it's a joint modified adjusted gross income. So I can tell you very practically how, and by the way, this happens a lot where, one client's 64 and the other 62. And so the next year that person ages out, goes on to Medicare, and we've got 2 more years for the other person to be on an ACA plan. And in that scenario, we're still doing our best to control modified adjusted gross income and playing this ACA game to try to ensure that we're honed in on the right number. You bring up a good point, Michael, and there has been a situation or two that I've seen where we can rationalize doing married filing separately. But in most cases, and if Matt was on here, he'd preach this too. That is like the worst way to file. So, we want to kind of marry. Again, this is the the overlay of insurance planning, tax planning, and appropriate investment management. And so we want to make sure that we're not solely focused on one thing so much that we're sacrificing somewhere else. And so in most cases, we can, this will be accomplished under filing a joint tax return, and we're looking at modified adjusted gross income for. I think where it might become challenging would be if there was a substantial age gap. So someone's turning 65 next year and the spouse is 53. And, now we've got a lot of years where we got to plan for it. So that could certainly be a challenge. So it brings up a good point. And that's the interesting thing about this. And maybe this is a good segue into this chart. Do we, we're not like navigators on healthcare.gov. We don't represent or act as like a broker to help people sign up. But just through the sheer amount of times we've had these conversations, one thing that I've learned is that it's very situational, and there might not always be a path, but there's ways to optimize it somehow. And again, it might not be quite as specific as getting all the way down to 100% of the or 150% of the federal poverty line, but there are ways to optimize. So it's very situational and kind of worth having that one-off conversation to talk through it if we need to on a case-by-case basis. So as Michael, as you mentioned, there's a couple things I want to mention. And I mentioned this already, but it's worth mentioning again. These are guarantee issue plans. Like they can't exclude you or rate you because you have some pre-existing condition. You can be rated for smoker versus non-smoker, but just because you've had a history of cancer or a heart condition or what have you, they can't decline you or rate you because of that. And I think that's really important because in that way, it does operate similarly to Medicare. And emergency care is covered out of network. But again, I said this at the beginning, it's managed care. Like you're going to be working within a group of doctors. And there are all kinds of companies that offer all four of these offerings. So you've got, bronze on one hand is a 60-40 plan, meaning the insurance company covers 60 and you pay 40%. And it's got a much higher out-of-pocket cost and deductible and things of that nature. Versus if I contrast that to a platinum plan, this is going to be somebody that has more chronic issues. This is a 90-10 plan. It's going to be more expensive. No matter what plan you go on, it doesn't like change your subsidy. It just, your premium might be a little bit higher net of that subsidy that's applied to like a platinum plan versus a silver plan, for example. But you've got a 90-10 plan here with the platinum. But across all of these, you're still looking at companies like, Cignas and Humanas. There's some name brand companies that you'd recognize in the insurance space. There's a lot of companies that you probably never heard of too. All require, have their own merits and require their own due diligence. But this is stuff we do love talking about. Again, we're not like brokers that sign people up for these plans, but we've navigated this far, quite a bit, especially during open enrollment season. And open enrollment season starts in November. So November 15th, and actually runs all the way up until January 15th. But for the folks listening to this, that like if you're considering something like this, your open enrollment's not necessarily the same. So there's a special enrollment window. That's going to be 60 days from the time of the major life event, which for most of you considering this type of thing, it would be retirement. So you are losing coverage. So you lose major credible coverage through your employer. At that point, you've got 60 days from the time that ends to sign up on one of these bronze, silver, gold, or platinum plans. And there's a plethora of things I could talk about in here, Michael, I don't know if you had any specific questions, but at least this gives you kind of a lay of the land of how they work.
No, I think that pretty sums it up. There's options on the marketplace, and like you said, the benefit doesn't necessarily change. It's just which plan makes the most sense for your life.
Yeah. Yeah. So as we're wrapping up today, I would say, obviously, so this is fun because for some of you, these names and faces I recognize, like we've done this planning, or we're enacting this planning with you, which is pretty cool. But if this sparks a conversation or questions that you want to have for some of the planning that we're doing this year, that's perfect. Like that's what we want, because we like, having a cadence of standard review meetings with clients. But the hope is when we do these sessions that it maybe sparks a conversation or two of like, hey, what about that? And so, and again, this is the beauty of the ensemble that Michael, Matt, and I preach, is that this involves really all three of us, this specific niche area of planning. So it's something that's kind of fun for us. So if anyone's got questions afterwards or wants to have a follow-up conversation, just get with one of us, and we'll certainly do that, or make sure it's part of the next review meeting that you have with us.
Yep. We've got one last question, John. We'll hit this stuff real quick. What happens if you go onto this plan because you think you're retiring, and then you decide 6 months in that you don't want to retire, and you take a job offer to go back to your employer to do something? Do you owe a bunch of credits back? What happens in that situation?
Timing matters in that scenario. So the short answer would be, you would hopefully go back to work for a company that has insurance. Yep. So you'd probably go on their employer plan, because the moment you turn your income back on, that's going to inflate your modified adjusted gross income to a point where this probably doesn't work anymore, most likely.
Sure.
And so the timing matters, meaning if you make this decision in June and you've had 6 months of, let's say you're a couple getting $2,000 a month. So you've had $12,000 of tax credits. And then from July to December, it inflates your income far beyond a number than you projected when you initially signed up. Yeah. Like you're going to owe some money back. Now, if you wait closer towards the end of the year, or maybe your start date isn't until 1/1 of the following year, it's in the tax year. So 1/1 to 12/31. So the timing of that actually does matter. And I think there could be some fun planning around that we could collaborate with you on. So,
yep. But definitely I think the timing matters on that. And again, if this was a plan we were putting in place, we want to have those conversations about returning to work and what the substantial implications are in that scenario. But as always, wanted to mention, best way keeping up with us, John has the podcast, the Above Board podcast with Matt and Rich, frequently, and a plethora of different topics.
Don't undersell yourself. You're on there more often than you probably like to be on there.
I'm on there generally when economic calamities occur, and got to come on and explain things. But also have social media. One of the best ways to talk and interact with us is on social media. Great at following up there. But then specifically, this entire webinar is about Affordable Care Act planning, and it's bridging the gap to Medicare. John wanted to mention we have a resource for Medicare at canterpath.com/Medicare. You'll see a planning guide to navigating Medicare. There's a lot of useful information there. So if you're thinking about what that might look for you, that breaks down an entire timeline leading up to Medicare and things you should be thinking about. So as always, John, great time talking through this with you today.
It was a good time. Yeah, I enjoyed it. And to the point that Michael made with Medicare, we do another webinar like this coming, I think it's going to be October time. So stay tuned for that. But yeah, this was a lot to unpack, but it was fun. Thanks for hanging with us. Sorry if we went a few minutes over on time, but I think it was well worth it. So we'll let everybody go, and we'll talk with you all soon.